Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Beneath the Red Star podcast, a Russian history podcast for normal people. I am your host, Kyle, and today I have somewhat of an interesting, kind of different topic to go over. This is a topic today that's a little bit more about modern Russia. Well, actually, it's entirely about modern Russia, and it's not even necessarily like a historical thing. This is more about modern Russian politics. So, what we're talking about today is Alexei Navalny. Alexei Navalny is someone who there's a really good chance that you've probably heard of him, at least in passing, particularly because he died not all that long ago. Actually, he died on February 16th of this year, of 2024. And since his death, his legacy has really been talked quite a bit about, especially because he died in a time where fascism, anti-democratic practices, and discussion about, dealing with one's political rivals, particularly here in the United States, has become kind of in vogue, or at least it has with certain parts of the American political spectrum, and with an unfortunate amount of people, both in America, but also all over Europe and the rest of the world. So, like I was saying, Alexei Navalny has really become quite a symbol lately, and there's quite a bit of discussion about what his life and death means. And I kind of want to weigh in on that because, while for the most part, the kind of broad pieces of Alexei's life and his biography are, done pretty well, I think there's a bit of a lack of discussion on his own personal politics and what that kind of has to say about his own legacy. So let's go ahead and jump into that right now, and we'll talk about a young Alexei Navalny who was born June 4th, 1976, on the outskirts of Moscow. His father was a military officer and his mother was an economist, and because his dad was an army officer, they moved around quite a lot, and they stayed basically within the Moscow region, going from garrison town to garrison town. But during the summer, Navalny would go visit his grandmother who lived near Chernobyl. And if you know Chernobyl, you know what happened at Chernobyl. It kind of, exploded. And fortunately for a young Alexei, he wasn't there for that. But a lot of his family did live in the area, and they told him about what they saw. Mostly what they saw was government mismanagement, corruption, and kind of rank incompetence as the Soviet government failed to respond to this crisis, and even would use people kind of as props. There's one story that you'll hear every now and then in Alexei's biography of people being sent to Chernobyl to pose for pictures as the Soviet government says, hey, look, everything's safe and fine and you can all come back now. But of course it wasn't safe, it wasn't fine. And a lot of these people ended up getting horribly ill and even dying from the radiation. And this left kind of a mark in a young Alexei's life as he saw, or at least heard firsthand, about the corruption and governmental mismanagement and incompetence. And this apparently is kind of where he started off on his crusade against corruption. But this would kind of be dormant until about 1998, because from the late 80s until almost the early 2000s, it would appear that Alexei Navalny was not exactly doing a whole lot of anything, which, fair enough, he was a child at this point and a teenager. So by 1998, he graduated from the People's Friendship University of Russia with a degree in law, which, holy shit, now that's just the name of a school. And then in 2001, he graduates from a school with an even better name, the Financial University under the government of the Russian Federation. I don't even know what to say, what the hell? But he gets a degree in economics. And what's kind of interesting about these degrees is his law and economics degrees are things that are oftentimes pointed to by both himself and quite a few other people, particularly journalists, to kind of show his credentials, that he's not just some kind of crazy anti-corruption guy. He does have, not just a degree, but 2 degrees, which, to be fair, I guess, yay, that's good, but also, I don't know, man, it doesn't really take that much to go, hey, man, the Russian government's pretty fucked up, we should do something about it. But either way, the reason I bring these up is because these are things that a lot of people talk about, that he would point to, and that his supporters point to quite a bit as being important to his image. So I do want to put them out there. While he's in school, he also gets involved in politics. In the year 2000, he joins the Yabloko Party. So the Yabloko Party is a pretty just kind of left of center, milquetoast liberal Democrat party. Think kind of like the American Democrats. These people are not necessarily radicals. They're certainly not Marxists or anything like that, but they're also not conservatives. They believe in democracy and a free market economy. But apparently, Navalny didn't get along particularly well with the people in the Yabloko Party, because only 7 years later, he was removed from the Yabloko Party. And so Yabloko's take on this is that he was removed for nationalist activities that damaged the party and their image, and Navalny's take on this was that he was removed because of personal issues between him and the chair, Grigory Yavlinsky. So there's a bit of some dissension here on, kind of what happened, but long and short of it, he does get kicked out in 2007, and actually this for his political career and kind of for his fame is a great thing. His removal from Yabloko opened up the space that he needed to really become the dissident that he would be. And even just a year later in 2008, he begins his first campaign against the Putin government. And what's kind of neat about this campaign is it's not a political campaign. He's not going to run for office, at least not yet. Instead, this is somewhat of kind of a social campaign. And what he does is he buys stock in publicly traded state-run companies. That way he can get onto the board and basically go through their books and look for irregularities. And then when he finds them, he would go to board meetings and yell at these people and be like, hey, what the hell are you doing? Which, that's kind of fun. But really, the most important thing about this is he would then report his findings on his blog. And what's neat about that is really at this time, you have quite a bit of clamping down on the Russian press. Vladimir Putin is firmly in charge by 2008. He has pretty serious control over really all facets of Russian life, but the internet is still a fairly new thing, and there's quite a bit of loosey-goosiness to it. And as well, you just have a guy who's using fairly newfangled technology, even aside from just the difficulty for the government to regulate. There's some serious novelty in this that really up to this point, no one has done anything quite like this in Russia, or at least not so successfully. And let me tell you, this blog becomes really successful. In fact, it becomes so popular that Dmitry Medvedev, at the time, he is the Russian president, but make no mistake, he's a Putin lackey, and he is, at the moment, Putin's vice president. So Medvedev admits to roughly 1 trillion rubles, or $31 billion, having been embezzled from the state procurement system, which is, one, that's a pretty good sum of money, and two, that shows the amount of pressure that Navalny was putting on the Putin regime. And like I said, yes, I know Medvedev was in charge, but really this is the Putin regime. So it shows the pressure that he was putting on them that a strongman government would go out of its way to say, okay, yeah, you got us, you're right. Now, did this do anything? Not really. There was no changes that happened. But what this did is this put Navalny on the map, and it started the conversation for a lot of people. And Navalny would make sure to capitalize on this and continue this conversation. And how he did this is in December of 2010, he created the website Raspil. And what Raspil was, is it wasn't a blog in the same way as his own personal blog from before. Instead, this was almost more like a forum, where of course he and his supporters would go on and post and write about corruption that they see, but also it was open to anyone to come in and write about corruption that they were seeing. Oh, hey, you work at, a military plant, and you see, they're not putting, say fuses in the bombs or something because it's cheaper that way. Or, oh, they're buying cheaper metal for this construction site that I work at, or, what have you. You're seeing corruption. And you could put this on this website and you can kind of compare and contrast. And what it really did is it made a space in which people could see, holy cow, this corruption isn't just something that's happening where I am or something that's happening maybe in a few places. It's happening everywhere. All of a sudden, you can see everyone around you seems to be noticing corruption. And it really kind of put into people's heads just how corrupt the Russian state is. And again, I really like to point out that this is very unique. This is fairly novel because this is all being done over the internet. And now, of course, in 2024, of course, all this shit's going to be on the internet. But in 2010, not necessarily, particularly in Russia, a country that, definitely took a little bit longer to kind of get into this space. And really what this did is it just made Navalny even more of a household name. And by 2011, Navalny's about as popular as ever. And in 2011, you also have Duma elections. So the Russian Duma is basically Russian Congress or Parliament. These are the people, the legislators who pass the laws. And so Navalny urged the people of Russia to vote for any other party than the United Russia Party, which is Putin's party. And even though there were quite a few noted irregularities in the polling, the United Russia Party got less than half of the votes, which is pretty insane for a country like Russia, which has such a robust vote-stealing system. And in response to all of these irregularities, there were mass protests. And Navalny, as you might imagine, was engaged in these protests. He was a protest leader, and for his part, he was arrested and sentenced to 15 days in prison. Once he was arrested, the protests got even bigger. In fact, these were the largest protests in Russia since the fall of the USSR, which I know that might seem kind of nebulous as a number, and I can't necessarily give you how many people, but just mind you, when the USSR fell, there was a coup, or at least an attempted coup. People were on the street almost constantly. So for this to be a protest kind of thought in the same mindset as those, these were big protests. And what does an autocrat do when there are big protests? He cracks down. So Putin does just that. He starts locking people away, creating harsher penalties for protesting, makes it harder to protest legally, all that fun stuff. And one of the things that he does is he starts targeting the leaders of these protest movements. And although Navalny has already been to prison for this, his home is raided on suspicion of corruption. After this, Navalny is released, and despite Putin's best efforts, Navalny's popularity only skyrockets. Navalny takes advantage of his popularity by, in 2013, he decides he's going to run for the mayor of Moscow. So on July 17th of 2013, Alexei Navalny declares his candidacy for the Moscow mayor. The very next day, on July 18th, he's found guilty of those corruption charges that were brought up earlier in 2011. So Navalny gets sentenced to 5 years in prison. And pretty much everyone understood, yeah, this is a sham, that, okay, sure, the guy's being corrupt or whatever. One, as if the Russian government really cares. And two, this is, of course, whatever information you could find, whatever proof you might have, none of it is believable. We all know what's going on here. So, with that knowledge, protests begin again. Even though Vladimir Putin had just been cracking down on protests, had been making it harder, had been upping the penalties, had been making it genuinely dangerous to go out on the street, the people of Russia were not interested. They knew that what was going on was, 1, immoral, and 2, illegal, and they were going to make their voices heard. And make their voices heard they did. Navalny was released the very next day after the protests began. His charges were suspended, but he was still a convicted criminal. And what that means is he can't run for office now. So he's not going to sit in jail for 5 years, but he is no longer allowed to run for office. So Navalny changes tack. And so before, where he was trying to, kind of run for office and be engaged very directly in the political system, now he's kind of moving over to more of like a power broker in a lot of way. Basically, how he does this is he finds people that he likes, and he throws his name behind them. You see this a lot here in the US. Barack Obama might go and say, hey, I want such and such governor to win. And just to, because people know Barack Obama. We don't know, say, the governor of wherever. We know Obama, so, oh, hey, Obama likes him, I like him. Same kind of thing. And this really works because Navalny is such a figure. And a good example of Navalny using his power and his influence is in the presidential election in 2018 in Russia. So Navalny calls for a boycott of the Russian election in March of that year. The date itself was chosen because it was the 4-year anniversary of the Russian annexation of Crimea. And the whole thought was it was going to get people kind of, engaged, and it's going to make this kind of, patriotic fervor out there in the people. And, it kind of did, I guess, because while certainly there are quite a few Russians who do not support the current war in Ukraine or the previous war in Ukraine, which is kind of still just part of this war in Ukraine, but I digress, there is still quite a bit of popularity, particularly for the annexation of Crimea. So, did it work? Well, not really. At the end of the day, Navalny kind of won. Quite a few people ultimately did boycott the election, even though, Putin was doing his old grand patriotism thing to try and get everybody out there. And one of the things that's particularly interesting to me anyways about this election is I was there for this one. I was in Russia for the 2018 presidential election. And I talked to quite a few people while I was there about what their plans were for the election. And I heard a lot of the same stuff. And ultimately, it was a lot of people saying that no, they were not going to vote in the election. They had no interest in voting because they knew exactly how it was going to pan out. Now, one of the things that's particularly interesting is none of them brought up Navalny. No one mentioned him by name or even kind of referenced him at all. But I do know that while I was there was quite a bit of pro-Navalny sentiment, even if necessarily the people I was talking to didn't say anything. And how I know this is I accidentally walked into a pro-Navalny protest. What happened is I was getting off of the metro and I was walking out onto one of the larger streets of St. Petersburg, and no one was there. I mean, the whole street was completely empty. And my first thought was maybe there's I don't know, some event or parade, because those happen sometimes, and it kind of looked like this. And what really kind of caught my eye was there were barricades in the middle of the street. These were little metal ones that would normally be put in front of, stores, just so that, to create a line or something. But they were all out in the middle of the street. And I didn't really think a whole lot of it. And I looked down to the end of the street, and there were a bunch of people over there. And I, an American in Russia, was not about to go investigate whatever the hell was going on with some large mass disturbance. Not until I got back to the family that I was staying with did I see on the news that it was a protest that ultimately devolved into a riot, and that pro-Navalny protesters were facing off with the police, and a good number of them were arrested. So what that kind of tells me is, yeah, Navalny was still able to activate people, even though he had been removed from the political kind of, I don't want to say mainstream, but the political direct action, I guess. Things like running for a political office. So 2 years after the election in 2018, Navalny's luck would begin to run out. Because in 2020, he was still doing what he was doing. He'd go throw his name behind people and try and get support for them. And this would work fairly well until he came down with a bad case of being poisoned. And so this happened in August of 2020, and immediately his family had him flown out of Russia because they knew what was going on. They understood that he'd been poisoned, and they understood who did it. So they went to Germany, somewhere hopefully that would be a little bit safer than anywhere in Russia, or even really anywhere in kind of the post-Soviet world. So once he arrived in Germany, Navalny was put in a 3-week-long medically induced coma while he recovered. When he awoke, he was approached by Bellingcat, and they worked together to figure out who it was who had poisoned him. And actually, their investigation was quite fruitful. Not only did they figure out that the FSB, basically the Russian, FBI, had poisoned him, but they were even able to figure out the specific individuals who did it. So, not your best work, FSB, I guess. Though Navalny was not one to really stay down. Because on January 17th of 2021, the very next year, Navalny had recovered and immediately returned to Russia, even though he knew what was going to happen, which was his arrest as soon as he got off the airplane. And so according to Russian authorities, he was arrested for failing to report to them as part of the terms of his suspended sentence. Basically, hey man, when we said you don't have to go to jail anymore, we said you're going to have to come check in with us every now and then, kind of, like a parole thing. And since you were poisoned and in a coma and in another country, well, sorry, Charlie, but it's jail time now. And so Navalny would spend the rest of his life in various Russian prisons and penal colonies. But while he was in prison, he continued to have quite a bit of influence on the opposition, and there were multiple protests that were carried out in support of him, which already this was quite dangerous. But this became even more so because in June of 2021, a Moscow court ruled that any group tied to Alexei Navalny would be labeled an extremist organization. This did not stop people. I know a lot of people talk a lot about how, the Putin regime is so scary. And every time there's big protests, people say, it's so rare that there are protests. Sure, it's not maybe as common as in, say, the United States, but the people in Russia get it. The people of Russia do not take shit from anyone. And I have quite a bit of respect for the Russian people. Not necessarily all of them, of course. There are plenty that suck, but there are quite a few who have made it very, very clear that they do not support Putin. They do not support the war in Ukraine. They do not support the corruption, lies, authoritarian bullshit, whatever. And these people have paid with their lives. So I got quite a bit of respect for these people. But unfortunately, despite all of the valiant efforts and the fighting that they put up, on February 16th of 2024, Alexei Navalny would die. The Russian government says that it was of natural causes, though, considering this is a man that they poisoned previously, I don't think it really is kind of beyond the pale to say that they murdered the shit out of him. Yeah, he got murdered. And with the death of Alexei Navalny, we kind of enter into a very uncomfortable space here for the future, for the Russian people, particularly Russian dissidents, because Alexei Navalny was a man who really kind of brought everyone together. And in some ways it was because he personally wanted to, but in a lot of ways it actually had nothing to do with people's belief in him or in his own politics. It was just that he was a guy who until this point seemed like he couldn't be killed. He seemed almost too important, too popular, too whatever. It almost seemed like nothing could happen to him. And that, on one hand, is very, very dangerous where we are now, because it shows that the Putin regime is not afraid to touch basically anyone. And two, what it is it's unfortunate for those who are resisting the Putin regime, because this was somebody who they could all rally around. And what's interesting about that is here on kind of, the Western side of things, here in America, we go, well, of course he's a man you want to rally around. He's a great guy. He's wonderful. He's awesome. But that's not necessarily how everyone in Russia felt. And we'll get into that here in a second, but that's really what I want this to be about. Because everything up until now is more or less how we are told Alexei Navalny was. He was a hero. He was a guy who was very, pro-democratic. He loved freedom and he was willing to die for it. He was very clean-cut and principled and respectable. He wasn't violent or really rough around the edges. He was, I like to think of him as kind of a freedom fighter you can take home to your parents, He never, wore a mask or burned down buildings or any of the other things that kind of cause chagrin in a lot of other people who, say, support protest movements but always get kind of, a little antsy. It was like, oh, well, they went a little too far. Alexei Navalny wasn't that kind of person. He really, really, really fit the kind of liberal Democrat freedom fighter guy. But there were certain things that he did that would make those people mighty uncomfortable. But a lot of that stuff gets left out of the reporting that we've seen, particularly after his death. And to kind of make that point, everything that you've heard so far, his whole biography, as I've said so far, is just a summation of what you generally hear from most Western news media outlets. Actually, to make that point, I'll tell you the sources that I used to write that. They were The Washington Post, Reuters, Time Magazine, The Guardian, BBC, and The Associated Press. Normally, I try to use more kind of scholarly sources, but for one, this is a modern topic, so I thought that using news sources would be a pretty good option. And two, I really want you to understand kind of how lionized this guy was by Western media sources. And I'm not saying that, he's the worst human being in the world or anything. That's not what this is going to be about. I mean, I think that he is not great, but you really cannot argue with what he did. Everything that I've said he's done, he did do. But I just think that going forward, we need to understand a little bit more about what Alexei Navalny wanted, kind of in his end game, if you will. Because most people understand that, sure, he wants democracy. He wants a kind of liberal freedom ideals. I don't really know what to call it, so there you go. Liberal freedom ideals. He wants to, fight against oppression and authoritarianism. And that's all wonderful. That's great. But what does he want to replace it with? And Alexei Navalny was pretty scant on details. But we can see a little bit of how he viewed the world and maybe what, say, an Alexei Navalny for president would have, done to Russia. So to really understand Alexei Navalny's political ideas outside of being pro-democratic, let's roll it back to 2007 when he was removed from Yabloko. So as I said before, Yabloko was a pretty bog standard liberal Democrat, left of center party. And Navalny maintained that he was removed from Yabloko because of personal issues with the chair of the party. Yabloko says Navalny was removed because of his nationalistic behaviors that made the party look bad and didn't fit party goals. So, who do we believe? Well, I'm going to take Yabloko's word on this because, of what Navalny did in, 2007 and then what he continued to do into 2008, in particular because of his presence and association with the Russia March. So the Russia March is a yearly march that occurs in multiple cities around Russia. The march is organized and hosted by the Movement Against Illegal Immigration. The Movement Against Illegal Immigration is a known right-wing xenophobic anti-immigrant nationalist organization. And liberal politicians don't attend this march. This isn't something that, people kind of appear at. Imagine if Nancy Pelosi showed up at the Unite the Right rally. This would be something that would, hopefully anyways, completely tank her career and whatever image she has of being not a Nazi. So, speaking of Nazis, this march is very broad in the kind of people that it attracts, but to be fair, these are all certainly people who are on the right. These are not going to be anyone left of kind of your grumpy old grandpa who hates those people. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you have out and out Nazis. And one of the things you can do if you don't believe me is go ahead and check out pictures of the march, and you will see a decent number of flags that look uncomfortably like swastikas. And you'll also see a lot of Imperial Russian flags, which are a yellow, black, and white tricolor flag. And in and of itself, it's like, okay, so what? These are people who lived in Russia. They like the Russian Empire. And okay, sure, whatever. But it's much in kind of the same vein as, say, the Confederate flag. A lot of these people say, oh, it's my heritage. It's like, yeah, but we kind of know what you're doing here. And much like the old stars and bars, the Russian imperial flag is something that is very, very popular in a lot of these more kind of authoritarian, conservative, fascist right-wing circles. And aside from the kind of politics of it, it is particularly odd to see Alexei Navalny engaging with people like that, being such a staunchly pro-democrat candidate. And Navalny's take on his association with these folks was that he didn't necessarily agree with them, but he saw his affiliation with them as a way to connect with the Russian right wing and to kind of temper them and bring them over to his side. I find this argument to be a little bit less convincing, and also I find generally that plan is not great in general. That doesn't normally work. Very famously, a lot of people thought they could temper Hitler and control him, and you all know what World War II is, but I digress. So I don't necessarily find Alexei Navalny's argument particularly convincing. And here's my proof. So at the same time as the Russia March and his removal from Yabloko, this being 2007 to 2008, Navalny started a new movement. And this would be the Russian National Liberation Movement, or better known by its acronym Narod, which Narod in Russian means the people, kind of like, say, pueblo in Spanish, or Volk in German. And if your kind of spidey senses went off a little bit when I said Volk, that's good, because while, it certainly does mean just the people, it was a very popular, and still is a very popular, Nazi and right-wing kind of word, who are the Volk that, say, the Nazis were always talking about, who are the people. And I think maybe, you might say, oh, that's a bit of a stretch. I don't. I think it is certainly a little bit telling that Alexei Navalny is using pretty common right-wing dog whistles here for, the people. And he makes it pretty clear who he thinks the people are. So Narod was directly associated with the movement against illegal immigration and played very heavily on Russian fears about illegal immigration, which I know for a lot of people here in the US, it might seem a little weird that other countries are kind of dealing with illegal immigration nonsense as well. And don't worry, it's just as stupid there as it is here. And what it comes down to is the kind of people that, a lot of Russians are worried about, I guess, are people from Central Asia and the Caucasus. And in 2008, we'll start with the Caucasus, we are in the waning days of the Second Chechen War, and there's quite a bit of anti-Muslim concern and fears. Now, the problem is, of course, much like a lot of the people here who are, from whatever group that we don't like crossing the border, a lot of those people were here before Russia got there, or before the US got there here in, South Texas where I live. But I digress. A lot of these people already lived in Russia because Russia came and took them in. One of these places being Chechnya. But so there's quite a bit of concern because there are other people from other Caucasus region countries that are coming to Russia because they do have jobs, they do have more opportunity. There is more potential for these people to have potentially a better life. Let's see how many times I can say potential in one sentence. But they're trying to come into Russia to seek a better life. And of course, the vast majority of them are never going to do anything wrong and never have and never will. But there is quite a bit of concern because at the same time as this war in Chechnya, there's, of course, all the wars that are going on in Iraq and Afghanistan and all the terrorism concerns. The global war of terror is in full swing, and Russia does not escape that. Neither do the Russian citizens. As well, you have people from Central Asia, these being the stands, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, whatever. And again, a lot of these people live in Russia because these are places that used to be partially or fully controlled by the Russian Empire or the USSR. So a lot of these people lived there anyhow. Again, Russia came right up to them and swallowed them up. So of course there's going to be plenty of them in Russia. But as well, a lot of these places are quite a bit poorer and less industrialized than Russia. So a lot of these people are moving into Russia, especially now in kind of the late aughts, because Russia is so much more stable and has done a better job of stabilizing after the collapse of the Soviet Union than a lot of these other countries. And you did have quite a bit of immigration at the time, legal or illegal. And you see a lot of the same concerns then as you do now about, oh, they're going to change Russia, and oh, they don't understand the culture, the religion, or the blah-de-blah-de-blah. And all of it's dumb and racist and stupid, but to a lot of people, it was enough to motivate them. Alexei Navalny was one of these people that it did motivate. And how we really can see that is in 2008, Alexei Navalny made 2 videos for Narod. And you can still see them today. They're on Navalny's personal YouTube channel and have the Narod name emblazoned on them. It's like the first thing you see. And the first one is Alexei Navalny standing in front of a camera talking directly at the audience with a video screen next to him. And he's talking about how you can kill bugs and the best way to deal with bugs. He's talking about flies and cockroaches. And then this takes a very concerning turn because when he says the best way to kill really big bugs and then flashes pictures of Chechen people, he pulls out a gun and says the best way to kill these bugs is with a gun. And then, out of nowhere, a man who is very stereotypically dressed like a Muslim charges onto the screen and Alexei Navalny shoots him dead. So, yeah. I don't feel like I really need to explain how, calling people bugs or cockroaches and saying that you should shoot them is a bad idea. But, hey man, apparently according to Alexei Navalny, that's the direction that Russia should go in. And that's only one of the 2 videos. The second video is about teeth. And yeah, it's just as weird as you might think. So the video starts, and there's Dr. Alexei Navalny doing some kind of dental work on a patient. He's wearing scrubs, he's in a dentist's office, and he starts talking about how important it is to have clean teeth and how you need to sanitize your mouth and how you can't allow certain kinds of rotten teeth to infect your mouth and to degrade your health. And while he's talking about this, images of people from Central Asia are up on the screen, and he calls for a full sanitation of, the Russian body. So, that seems pretty cut and dry to me. But still, there are those who would argue that, oh, well, maybe he didn't really mean this stuff. Maybe he was just saying it to kind of, create this bridge to the right wing and try to pull people over. And my thought on the matter is, I don't really care at the end of the day if he believes this or not. This is damaging. This is dangerous stuff. And I really do think he did believe it. But even if he didn't, this is not okay. And I don't know if this makes it better, worse, whatever, but I really do think he believed this stuff. And a big reason why is because he never apologized. He never said, like, oh shit, yeah, that was bad. He never explained it. He just put them out there, and this is all the context we have. Again, you can go watch those videos. You can go see for yourself. They are just as bad as they sound. And this isn't even really where Alexei Navalny stops on the issue of people who live in Russia who aren't quote-unquote Russian. And that's because in 2008, the Russian Federation invades the country of Georgia. And the reason is basically Georgia used to be a part of Russia and they want it back. And it, left during the collapse of the Soviet Union, and Georgia is pretty happy being its own country. But, of course, Russia is not happy with it not being its own country. It's 2024. You know how that goes. So, you would think that Alexei Navalny, lover of all things democratic and free, would say, hey, we shouldn't invade Georgia. We should not do this. Well, actually, no, that is not the case. Navalny fully supported the Russian invasion and referred to the people of Georgia as rodents, and openly supported the indiscriminate and brutal bombing campaign that was carried out by the Russian government. And again, it's 2024. We know what that indiscriminate and brutal bombing campaign looks like. Alexei Navalny was perfectly happy to see that in Georgia. Though, unlike his videos, he did ultimately apologize for his support of the war. Granted, this is 15 years later in 2023, after the invasion of Ukraine, and I really find it maybe a little suspect that he didn't say anything sooner and instead only brought it up after the fact when, Ukraine and Russia are in a war, and a very, very, very unpopular one at that, particularly for a lot of his supporters abroad who are doing a lot of legwork in making him into this kind of hero. So, maybe I am being a little cynical, but I really do think that context matters. So, you can come up with your own ideas, but yeah, I'll be perfectly honest, he's not my favorite human being on this planet. And I think it shows pretty well that in 2007 and 2008 that Navalny was maybe a bit more into the white ethno-state stuff than he lets on. And again, some people will say that this is not true, and one, I think it is, and I think it kind of shows itself that it's true. And even if it's not true, I really don't care. He did all of this stuff. I don't care for what reason. I don't care what it is that he ultimately was trying to do. You don't get to go on TV and say, hey man, X, Y, and Z people are cockroaches and I think you should shoot them. There is not really a good way in which you can do that. But those videos came out in 2008, and so was the war in Georgia. That was in 2008 as well. So maybe he's gotten better. Maybe since then he's really kind of turned around. And well, I've kind of already hinted at that. No, he hasn't. One, he never apologized for those videos, as I said prior, and two, it took him 15 years to turn around his opinion on Georgia. But let's go ahead and jump to a little bit of a more recent date to make my point. And that would be in 2019, Navalny stated that he wanted to update the way that Russia gave out visas. At the moment, to get into Russia, even just for a little bit, you need a visa. And it is a lengthy, difficult process that's more or less designed to make it hard and for you to fail. I know, I've done it, and I did ultimately fail and have to resubmit it. And of course, if you are somebody who doesn't have the same resources, who doesn't have the same access to the internet, who just, for whatever reason is not as privileged as someone like me here in the United States, it is going to be very difficult for you to get in. And so Navalny says, and to be fair, correctly, that this is, way too much. I think that this is too difficult of a system. We need to tone it down. So what he says is he wants to remove the visa system and allow people to come in just, with a passport and be able to stay there for a certain amount of time and to make things quite a bit easier to enter into the country. And you know what? That's great. But where it really falls apart is that's only for Europeans. People from the Caucasus, people from the Middle East, people from Central Asia would still be subject to very strict government oversight. They would be controlled on who could come in. They would be controlled where they could go once they get in, how long they could stay there. So, I guess, you could argue that that's some kind of progress, but it still shows very clearly that he sees certain people as worse, as less than Europeans, that somehow there is some inherent Russianness or civilization, a civilizedness, I guess, I don't know, that is not present in these people from other places. And I think that shows pretty well that no, he hasn't really changed. And Central Asia isn't the only place that really brought out Navalny's nationalist side. Ukraine has been a bit of a sticking point for him as well. To his credit, Navalny did call out the 2022 invasion of Ukraine as illegal and immoral and terrible. And, he is right. But this has not necessarily gotten the kind of support from people as you might hope, as maybe he might have hoped. Particularly not from Ukrainians, because they don't find his words to be particularly meaningful or truthful. And what a lot of this has to do is with the 15 points that he published right after the war started. He published these on Twitter, and you can find them. They're not particularly hard, but, just type in Navalny 15 points and they'll show up sooner or later. So these 15 points make it clear that he isn't a fan of the war, and in multiple points during his 15 points, he calls for the war to end, and he says that there should be reparations paid and yada yada. Clearly not a big fan of the war. But some of the points he makes don't really seem to add up with other things that he's said in the past. And this really has to do with point number 5, which states that Russia must recognize Ukraine's 1991 border. So 1991 is when the Soviet Union fell apart, and there were treaties that were signed that said, this is where Ukraine starts, this is where Russia starts. And so he's saying, we need to go back to that. We need to go back to the 1991 borders. But the problem is, Navalny has shown that he doesn't necessarily have a lot of respect for Ukraine's borders. In particular, not Crimea. So at one point, he was asked about what he thinks should be done with Crimea if he was the president. And this was in 2014. So this was right after Crimea was annexed. So to be fair, this was about 8 years in the past from his point. But what he says is that Crimea was not a sausage sandwich to be returned here or there, and that if he was the Russian president, he would not return the illegally annexed land. So this one shows pretty clearly that Navalny doesn't really have a ton of respect for Ukrainian sovereignty, and it's made some enemies for him in Ukraine. A lot of people are somewhat hesitant to believe him when he says that he does support the return to 1991 borders. As well, it's not just an issue of the borders, it's an issue of priority and kind of an issue of the way that Navalny frames his argument. Because Navalny's 15 points focuses less on the immorality of the war from the Ukrainian perspective, or kind of really just in general, and more about what a waste it is for Russia. The very first point isn't even that Ukrainians are being murdered, but rather that the war is unjust and the pretexts are ridiculous. And to be fair, you could argue that maybe this is a bit pedantic, but I do think it is fairly, commonplace to say if you're against a war, the first thing that you should say is the war stinks because it's bad for the people that are being attacked. This isn't an invasion of Russia by Ukraine, this is an invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And I think truly the greatest shame of this war isn't necessarily that, Russia's going to get hurt in this war. No, it's that Ukrainians are going to get hurt in this war. And a lot of Ukrainians are kind of upset about that, Navalny really doesn't make Ukraine nearly the kind of center of this as you would hope. Instead, he highlights the heavy losses for Russia's military, he highlights the economic loss, he highlights the gains for Russian people if they were to stop the war, particularly the economic benefits of trade with the rest of the world, and he highlights that Russia is losing. Which, again, seems kind of the wrong takeaway that, if you really don't like the war in Ukraine, I don't know, it seems a little bit weird if you're like, what really, really irks me? It's that we're the ones losing, that damn, this is such a shame. I don't know, I kind of get it in the sense that it's like, okay, this is for, say, a Russian audience potentially, and I want the Russians to read this and go, yes. And sure, you kind of need to put in reasons for why it's better for you to not get involved and why it's better for you to not be involved. I get that. But there really is so little focus on why this is bad kind of writ large. Instead, it's mostly, it's going to be bad for us, so we shouldn't do it. It really kind of raises the question of, if it wasn't so bad for Russia, would Navalny support the invasion? And to be fair, these aren't necessarily points that I'm coming up with on my own. I do believe these. I do agree with this assessment. But this is something that a number of Ukrainians have said, including people within Ukraine's government who have expressed concern over if there were to be a, Navalny presidency, what this would mean for Ukraine. But, of course, that is a potential reality that is not going to happen. As we know, and as I've said a couple times, Alexei Navalny was in fact killed in February. And after his death, there's been quite a response across Russia and in multiple post-Soviet countries, and people from these countries are speaking out about their opinions on Navalny, especially as he's being heralded as a hero by many within Russia and by many within the West. One example of this is former president of Georgia, Mikhail Saakashvili. Excuse me, I don't speak Georgian, and if I did, I would speak it very poorly. What he said in February of 2024 is that, "I know that many Ukrainians and Georgians still haven't forgiven him, but I still believe that in this situation, expressing such changes in position requires additional courage." What he's talking about is him changing his mind on the war in Georgia, that this former Georgian president is kind of absolving him. And sure, it certainly is something to see the former head of state of Georgia absolving him of kind of his guilt and saying that what he has done since then and his willingness to change his mind is important. And, arguably maybe it is. But I and many other people from Georgia and Ukraine and other countries around Russia and people within Russia have found that argument to be a little bit less than convincing. And even Saakashvili says that himself. He starts off with, "I know that many Ukrainians and Georgians still haven't forgiven him." But as I said, it's not just the Georgians and it's not just the Ukrainians that are having some issues with Navalny and the way that he is being remembered. This issue has really bubbled to the top in Siberia, where Central Asian Russians, these being people whose families are from places like Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, any of the kind of Central Asian countries just south of Siberian Russia, these people have been expressing some issues, some complaints with Navalny supporters that have held vigils at memorials for those killed in the famines of 1932 and 1933. Kind of on its face, sure, it makes sense. These memorials are for people who were killed by, say, the brutality of the Soviet Union. But Navalny was a very outspoken hater, really. He hated and was very open about his hate for people from Central Asia. And these memorials are specifically about Central Asian oppression. The famines in 1932 and 1933 are arguably, and I would argue as much, genocide that was carried out by the Soviet government against people in Central Asia and also against people in Ukraine. And so it seems really in bad taste for Navalny's vigils to be held here. And a lot of these people are not saying, "Oh, Navalny's evil and you shouldn't remember him or we hate him," but I think that it's fair for them to say that you should not have these vigils here. He's a man who clearly did not care for us, and this is a special place for our own history, and it is disrespectful. And, I think that's fair, and I do agree. I think it really does show just how complicated of a figure that Navalny is. And to loop back on something that I said earlier, and to add a little bit more context, I want to talk a little bit more about that protest that I accidentally walked through in St. Petersburg in 2018. I remember asking people about, why they weren't going to vote. And I told you that these people didn't bring up Navalny. And that is true, that this is not going to be saying, "Haha, I got you." But I did talk to them about Navalny at other times. And I heard a lot of the same stuff. Something that to me, as an American who'd only heard about Navalny, in my classes and on the news, was really surprised about. I was expecting people to say, "Oh yeah, no, either we love Navalny because he's fighting for democracy or we hate Navalny because we love Putin." Instead, their responses were quite a bit more nuanced. And what I heard a lot of was, "I don't like Navalny, but I will support him, because he's the only person that we can support. Everyone else has been killed, has been arrested, or has had to flee. He's the only one left." And this would not be the only time I heard that. After I graduated college, I went to Middlebury in Vermont to do Russian schooling there, and a number of the people who were professors were from Russia. And, talking to them, I heard a lot of the same stuff. People had issues with Navalny. People didn't like him even. They did not respect him. They did not want him to be the president. But they would throw their support in, for now anyways, because it was him or you go it alone. And that is just too dangerous. And I think that that's really the way that we should remember Navalny. Because in a lot of ways, he is the person that, the news media wants him to be. He is, in a lot of ways, very admirable. He gave his life for the cause. He believed in democracy and in fighting corruption and fighting Vladimir Putin, a man who is not really hard to say, yeah, he really sucks. But what we lose in this is kind of the nuance of just because Vladimir Putin is terrible doesn't mean that anyone who is against him isn't. And I also don't want this to be a kind of blanket condemnation of people who do support Navalny, who did support Navalny. Because again, his kind of presence, his symbol, particularly as really the guy who made people, as the guy who had all the power, it was important. And it's not hard to hear stories of people who didn't support Navalny, who didn't like Navalny, ultimately saying, well, we gotta play ball with this guy, because if we don't, we go it alone. And then we will have no one, and it will just be us versus the Russian government. And I know that there are people out there who are going to say, well, that's what you should do. You should never compromise ever, and you should always just, accept the way it is. And you know what? To those people, sure, man, whatever. But in reality, this is how kind of dissent works. This is how revolution works. This is how people fight against the systems that oppress them. They oftentimes have to make very uncomfortable alliances. They oftentimes end up giving their lives. They often end up giving their freedoms, giving up so much of themselves for people who ideologically they can't stand maybe even as much as the people that they're fighting against, but you need power to fight power. And Alexei Navalny had power. He had the ears of Western journalists. He had the ears of the Russian government. He had the presence, he had the political capital, and he had the actual capital, the money that he needed to do what needed to be done. And really going forward, I think that we need to think of Alexei Navalny a lot more like the way that the Russians who worked with him did. He was a very useful man. And I don't mean that to be rude. I understand that he's dead and that, we should have respect for him. But in reality, let's be real. He was a very useful man for the purpose of bringing democracy to Russia and for the purpose of fighting the Putin regime. But beyond that, I would be absolutely remiss to say that he should have ever been anywhere near the levers of power. And I think that if we think of him the same way that the people who didn't support him in his home country do, we'll have a much better, much more well-rounded idea of the man and of the legacy that he is going to leave. And really, that's why I wanted to do this. Because right now is the time that Alexei Navalny's legacy is going to be created. Right now is the time when Alexei Navalny is going to be penned into the history books, and how we talk about him now is the way that people are going to remember him 10 years from now, 100 years from now, whenever. And so far, everything I've seen is nothing but pretty broad lionization, maybe just vague mentions of, oh yeah, no, he was kicked out of Yabloko because they said he was a bit too nationalist. But that's still just that's not enough. No matter what he truly believed, no matter why he did the things he did, Alexei Navalny associated with some really nasty people, and he did some really, really nasty stuff. And we need to reckon with that. And we can say that he was a hero and that he fought for Russia and that he died for Russia and he had all these great ideas in his head. Sure, we can say that, but it would be absolutely unfair that in 10 years from now we tell our kids, oh yeah, there was this hero in Russia, and then leave out about how if and when he became the leader of Russia, he was going to enact horrible policies that would hurt people just because of their race, their religion, where they came from, or the language they spoke. So, like I said at the very beginning of this is definitely a little bit different than any of the other episodes that I've made so far, but I really hope that you find this one interesting. I hope that you find this maybe even enlightening. I don't know how really out there this information is, but I want it to be out there more than it is. However much it's out there, I want it to be out there more. So I really hope you enjoyed this. I really hope that you found this informative. And if not, well then I hope that at the very least I can get you to go out there and learn a little bit more about Alexei Navalny. There's plenty of resources out there, and I will link all of the resources that I use to write this in the show notes so that you can do your own research and go from there. But at the end of the day, thank you all for listening. I really appreciate you guys tuning in. If you like the show, or even if you didn't like the show, please consider leaving a comment. It helps me make the show better, and it helps, get the show out there, because an active community really helps the algorithm. And I don't know, that's what I heard. I don't know really all that much. I'm just kind of doing whatever. But thank you guys again for listening. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I will catch you for the next one. Bye-bye.